September 19th, 1944. In the countryside of Lorraine, eastern France, a thick white fog rolls across the fields before sunrise. Visibility is less than 50 yards. 200 American Sherman tanks sit still, low on fuel, dug into the earth. They cannot advance, they cannot retreat. All they can do is wait. Coming through the fog, 280 German Panther tanks, the most feared armor on the Western Front. Bigger guns, thicker armor, longer range. Superior in every way, the odds are brutal. Everyone says it takes 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Panther, and that 4 of those 5 Shermans will burn trying. The math says massacre. But 10 days later, the math is flipped. 281 German tanks are destroyed. Only 48 Shermans are lost. The kill ratio is 6-1 in favor of the Americans. How did that happen? This is the story of the battle the U.S. Army almost buried. The one that proved that tactics, training, and teamwork can beat technology. The battle that turned so-called death traps into the deadliest tank crews in Europe. This is the Battle of Arrancourt, and it rewrote everything they thought they knew about armored warfare. By September of 1944, every American tank crew in France had heard the same nickname, Ronson Lighter. The Sherman tank, they joked grimly, lit up the first time, every time. The British called it the Tommy Cooker. The message was clear. If a Sherman got hit, it burned. These weren't just jokes. They were forged in fire, in the hedgerows of Normandy, where the Shermans had met tigers, panthers, and ambushes from every tree line. In many armored battalions, casualty rates had passed 50%. Some crews didn't last a week. The numbers looked bad. The Sherman's 75mm gun could only penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at close range, about 300 to 500 yards, and only from the side. But the Panther's long 75mm gun could knock out a Sherman at over 2,000 yards, straight through the front. Tankers believed it took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther, and 4 of those Shermans would burn trying. It wasn't always true, but it felt true. And when you're in the hatch, watching your friends disappear in flame, feelings matter more than statistics. Crews began calling their own tanks rolling coffins. They tried everything to survive. Sandbags, welded track links, logs strapped to the sides for extra protection. They painted ammo boxes so they could grab armor-piercing rounds faster under pressure. Some removed the high-explosive shells completely. The goal wasn't victory. The goal was to stay alive. But what made it worse, what made the fear turn to frustration, was that higher command refused to act. The U.S. Ordnance Department had heard the complaints. They knew the Sherman was undergunned, but they stuck to doctrine. The Sherman wasn't meant to fight tanks, they argued. It was an infantry support platform. Enemy tanks were the job of tank destroyers, the M10s, the M18 Hellcats, the M36, not the Sherman. Adding a bigger gun would make the Sherman heavier, slower, harder to produce, they said. The whole point was mobility, mass production. Keep it simple, keep it cheap. But the men inside the tanks didn't feel cheap. They felt expendable. By the fall of 1944, that tension had become unbearable. Stories of German tank aces, like Michael Wittmann, spread fear through Allied ranks. At Villers-Bocage, Wittmann's Tiger had destroyed more than a dozen British tanks in minutes. The tale traveled across divisions like a ghost story. If one Tiger could do that, what could an entire brigade of Panthers do? And then came the worst moment of all. The fuel ran out. Patton's Third Army had raced across France, smashing German lines. But they'd outrun their supplies. And when the fuel dried up, the advance stopped cold. 200 Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored Division sat motionless near the French town of Arrancourt. They couldn't move, couldn't fall back, couldn't maneuver. They dug in. Defensive positions. Hull down. Waiting. Across the lines, the Germans saw their chance. A rare moment. The fog was coming. The skies were gray. The Americans couldn't call in air support, and their tanks weren't moving. The Panthers began to roll. To the men of the 4th Armored Division, it looked like suicide. But they had one thing the Panthers didn't. They had been learning the hard way for months. They had radios in every tank. They had battlefield experience. And they knew that the fight was coming to them. This wasn't going to be another retreat. This time, they would be ready. By mid-September, the 4th Armored Division found itself stuck. Literally. The tanks were in position. The crews were experienced. The men were ready. But they had no fuel. Patton's army had advanced faster than anyone thought possible, blitzed through France, broke German lines from Normandy to the Moselle River, but speed came at a cost. The fuel trucks, thousands of them, in the Red Ball Express, just couldn't keep up. The orders from high command were clear. Fuel priority was going to the north, to Montgomery's Operation Market Garden. An ambitious airborne offensive through Holland, meant to end the war by Christmas. So Patton's tanks stopped, dug in, near a quiet crossroads town called Aricourt. It wasn't the kind of place anyone expected to make history. It had no big roads, no rivers, just rolling farmland, low ridge lines, and a few stone villages. But to the Germans, Aricourt looked like a gift. Their intelligence told them Patton's forces were overextended, running low on supplies, exposed. And with the cloudy weather grounding Allied air support, this might be their only shot to break the Americans before winter set in. Adolf Hitler ordered a counterattack. The plan came from the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel. 2 new panzer brigades were created, the 111th and 113th. Between them, they fielded almost 300 tanks, including over 100 Panthers, brand new armor, freshly painted, ready to strike. But there was a problem. The crews were green. Many had only a few weeks of training. Some had never fired their guns in combat. The Panthers were powerful, but they were complex machines, prone to breakdowns, hard to maintain, and their radios were limited. Only the lead tanks in each platoon had one. Still, the Germans believed they had the advantage. They had better tanks. They had the element of surprise. And most of all, they believed the Americans wouldn't fight. Not without fuel. At night, under the cover of darkness and fog, the German columns began to move. Panthers in front, infantry and support vehicles behind. They aimed for Aricourt, hoping to punch a hole straight through the American lines. But what they didn't know, what their maps didn't show, was that the Americans were not unprepared. Major General John S. Wood, commander of the 4th Armored Division, didn't like to sit still. He was an aggressive leader, known as Professor Wood for his cerebral style, but his soldiers knew better. When he saw the supply lines choking, he didn't panic. He planned. He ordered every Sherman into defensive positions, dug in, hull down, pre-sighted firing lanes, artillery coordinates ready, radios tested and retested. Wood knew what was coming. Maybe not the exact hour, but the fog, the silence, the intel, it all pointed to one thing: a German armored push. So the Shermans waited. On September 19th, as dawn broke and the fog rolled in, the Panthers approached. But instead of steamrolling a surprised enemy, they were about to drive into a trap. The Panther and the fog. The German Panther was designed to dominate. Long, sleek, and deadly, it carried a 75mm high-velocity gun that could destroy a Sherman tank at 2,000 yards with a single shot. Its frontal armor was nearly impossible to penetrate. It was faster than a Tiger, better protected than a Panzer IV, and terrifying to any Allied tanker who saw it rolling over the horizon. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was complicated. The Panther's armor was sloped for deflection, but its sides and rear were thin. Its gun was powerful, but slow to rotate. Its engine was fast, but fragile. Its transmission and final drive were notorious for breakdowns, and its weight made it vulnerable on soft terrain. If a Panther bogged down in the mud, it was stuck. But the biggest flaw was this: the Panther was built for long-range combat. It needed visibility. It needed open fields. It needed distance. On the morning of September 19th, the Germans had none of that. As they advanced toward Ericourt, the fog settled in thick, rolling down from the Moselle River like a gray wall. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards, in some places less than 50. The Panthers were now driving blind. Only the lead tank in each platoon had a radio. The rest followed by formation. The doctrine was rigid. Attack in columns, keep spacing, trust the lead tank. But doctrine doesn't help when you can't see what's ahead. The American tankers, meanwhile, were ready. Their Shermans were in hull-down positions, engines warm, guns trained. They had pre-sighted fields of fire. They had artillery on standby. And most importantly, they had radios. Every tank, every platoon leader, every gunner could talk. Instantly. At around 7 o'clock in the morning, the first Panthers appeared out of the mist. They came slowly. No scouts ahead, no flankers. Just columns of armor rolling forward, expecting little resistance. What they got instead was a kill zone. From 75 yards, Sherman gunners opened fire. Armor-piercing rounds slammed into the sides of the lead tanks. 2 Panthers exploded within seconds. Their crews tried to return fire, but couldn't find targets. The fog turned muzzle flashes into ghosts. Sound echoed off the hills. Visibility meant nothing. The German line slowed. Confusion spread. The Panther commanders couldn't see, couldn't coordinate, couldn't flank. They had trained for range duels. Now they were in a knife fight, and the Shermans were winning it. At short range, the Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate a Panther's side or rear, and thanks to their radios, the American crews could coordinate flanking attacks, cover each other, and relocate fast. Shoot and scoot, fire and move. Meanwhile, the Panther's turret turned slowly. It took longer to traverse, and in the chaos, German crews often fired at empty positions where Shermans had already moved. The fog didn't just blind the Germans. It flipped the entire balance of power. A tank designed for the open plains of Russia was now helpless in the narrow lanes and rolling hills of Lorraine. Its advantages erased. Its weaknesses exposed. And it was just the beginning. By mid-morning, more than a dozen German tanks were burning. Columns of black smoke rose into the mist. American observers couldn't even count how many kills they had made. It was too chaotic. But they knew one thing. The Panther wasn't invincible. Not here. Not today. The German attack was supposed to be swift. Shock, breakthrough, collapse of the American line. Instead, it was confusion and fire. As more Panther columns rolled toward the American lines, the fog remained thick. Visibility stayed below 100 yards. The Germans couldn't deploy into proper battle formations. They couldn't see the enemy, and they couldn't talk to each other. Only the lead tank had a radio. If that tank was knocked out, and many were, the entire platoon was deaf and blind. The Shermans took full advantage. They weren't just firing from cover. They were coordinating ambushes in real time. Radio chatter buzzed across the 4th Armored Division's frequencies. Platoons calling out enemy positions, coordinating flank attacks, calling for artillery or smoke. The Germans were fighting by doctrine. The Americans were fighting with initiative. Here's how it worked. As a Panther approached, one Sherman would engage it from the front. The shot would bounce, sure, but that wasn't the point. The goal was to draw attention, to make the Panther turn. Meanwhile, 2 other Shermans, already moving, would attack from the sides. The moment the Panther's turret shifted, armor-piercing rounds came in from 90 degrees, right into its thinner side armor. The result? Penetration, explosion, kill. If the Panther survived the first hit, it rarely survived the second. Another tactic, shoot and scoot. Sherman gunners, pre-aimed and waiting, would fire 1 or 2 rounds. Then the tank would immediately reverse and relocate. Panther crews would return fire, but by the time they fired, the Sherman was gone. And from another angle, another Sherman opened fire. In some sectors, Shermans didn't wait for Panthers to appear. They called in artillery first. Pre-registered coordinates, blanketed roads and junctions with indirect fire. German tanks rolled forward into smoke and shrapnel, already off balance, already half blind. In one village, American infantry with bazookas and anti-tank mines hit German armor from alleys and side streets. Panthers that tried to flank were funneled into kill zones. Fields that looked empty were covered by hidden tanks waiting behind trees. The terrain favored the Americans. Rolling hills, tall hedgerows, orchards and narrow farm lanes. The Shermans were dug in, camouflaged, pre-positioned. And the Germans? They were on the move, in columns, with no real intelligence, no visibility, no flexibility. The battlefield became a graveyard. Panther after Panther was knocked out in rapid succession. Blackened hulls blocked roads. Flames roared through turrets. Crews bailed out under fire. In many cases, they didn't even know what hit them. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift. What it revealed was staggering. German tanks scattered across the countryside, burning, disabled, abandoned. Some with hatches still open. Some with crewmen slumped halfway out. Others smoldering with ammunition cooking off inside. American tankers couldn't believe what they were seeing. For months, they had feared these machines. Trained to think of Panthers as invincible, to expect loss, to accept inferiority. But now, the Panthers were dying, quickly, and the Shermans were still standing. Something had shifted. The myth had cracked, and the tankers of the 4th Armored Division weren't finished yet. By the afternoon of September 19th, the battlefield around Ericourt looked like the wreckage of a steel storm. Smoke hung low over the French countryside. The fog had thinned, but the haze of burning fuel and scorched rubber filled the air. The sounds of tank engines had faded, replaced by the crackling of fire, the hiss of overheating metal, and the occasional thunder of artillery still landing in the distance. German armored units had been shattered. The 11th Panzer Brigade, which had entered the day with close to 75 tanks, mostly Panthers, had lost over half its strength by sunset. More than 40 Panthers were confirmed destroyed or disabled. Some had been abandoned after mechanical breakdowns. Others had been hit directly, burned from the inside out. For the crews of the 4th Armored Division, it didn't feel like victory at first. The pace of combat had been so intense, so chaotic, that few had time to think. Many crews didn't realize how much damage they'd done until they emerged from their positions and saw the sheer number of burned-out hulks across the fields. Here's what a typical engagement looked like. Near the village of Rechicourt, a column of Panthers advanced confidently. They'd been told the Americans were out of fuel, vulnerable, likely to retreat. But 3 Shermans waited in ambush, camouflaged, engines off, guns trained on the lane. The lead Panther appeared through the trees. The first Sherman fired, directly at the front plate. The round bounced. The Panther's turret began to swing in response. Too late. The 2nd and 3rd Shermans fired simultaneously into the side and rear. One round struck the ammo rack. The tank exploded instantly, turret blown skyward. The next Panther rolled up blindly into the same trap. It ended the same way. All across the sector, that pattern repeated. German commanders tried to push forward, to reinforce, to coordinate a counterthrust. But without radios in most tanks, they couldn't respond fast enough. Without reconnaissance, they drove into unseen kill zones. And without air support, they had no idea what they were facing. American tankers stayed mobile, stayed flexible, used their radios like weapons, spotting targets, adjusting positions, calling for artillery, and tracking every German move. And the Panthers? They kept coming. Because Hitler's orders were simple: press the attack. Even as the casualties mounted, even as smoke columns marked every mile of the front, the German High Command refused to adapt. They believed the Panthers were invincible. That technology would carry the day. But in the fields around Aricourt, those tanks became tombs. Sherman crews began to realize something had changed. They were surviving. They were winning. And every wrecked Panther told the same story. This wasn't about armor. This wasn't about guns. This was about experience, tactics, and knowing how to fight the war they were in, not the war they'd trained for. The Americans were rewriting the rules, and the Panthers were dying by the dozens. But this was only day one. More attacks were coming, and the men of the 4th Armored Division were ready. 10 days of thunder, the Germans didn't stop. They couldn't. Hitler had ordered a full-scale counteroffensive to break the American advance and re-establish the front. So even after losing dozens of tanks on September 19th, they doubled down. On September 20th, more German armor rolled forward. This time, the 13th Panzer Brigade entered the fight. Fresh tanks, fresh crews, same orders: breakthrough at Aricourt. But the battlefield hadn't changed. The fog still clung to the valleys each morning, and the Shermans were still waiting. By now, the tankers of the 4th Armored Division had learned every tree line, every ridge, every road that the Germans might use. They had fought this terrain for days. Some positions had already been adjusted and reinforced. Artillery support was faster. Coordination was sharper. The Americans were getting better. The Germans were just getting bloodier. Each day followed a rhythm: morning fog, German attack, American ambush, smoking wrecks by noon. By September 22nd, the Americans were no longer just reacting. They were counterattacking. Small Sherman platoons, coordinated by radio, launched flanking thrusts, cut off enemy supply lines, and hit retreating Panthers in the rear. Infantry units with bazookas ambushed German support vehicles and captured fuel trucks. On September 23rd, the fog began to lift and the sky opened. American fighter bombers roared overhead. P-47 Thunderbolts, armed with rockets and 500-pound bombs, joined the fray. The German tanks, now exposed without air cover, were easy targets. American pilots circled above, diving into columns and hammering them from the sky. Tankers watched as Panthers exploded from direct rocket hits. Crews bailed out and ran for the trees. The open fields that had once favored the German guns now turned into killing zones for the Allied Air Force. By September 25th, the Germans changed tactics. They tried to flank the American lines, attack from the east, through wooded areas, and hit the rear. But they forgot who they were facing. Every Sherman had a radio. Every platoon could pivot within minutes. Combat Command A detected the German movement, relayed it across the line, and repositioned defenses before the Panthers could even arrive. The Germans walked straight into another ambush, another graveyard. Each day, more German tanks were lost. Each day, the Americans adapted faster, and the Panther, once feared, had become predictable. By September 29th, the 5th Panzer Army made one final push. Its last operational reserves, what remained of both the 11th and 13th Panzer Brigades, were committed to the fight. It didn't matter. The American lines held. The Shermans kept killing. In some areas, German officers refused to advance. Some tanks turned back. Others were captured intact after crews abandoned them mid-attack. Our Corps had become a proving ground, not for armor, but for ideas. Tactics over brute force, communication over complexity, adaptation over arrogance. And in 10 days of fighting, those ideas had consequences. The final tally, confirmed by aerial photos, unit records, and physical wreck counts, was staggering. 281 German armored vehicles destroyed. Approximately 180 were Panthers. The rest included Panzer III-4s, assault guns, and support vehicles. American losses: 48 Shermans destroyed. Over 100 damaged, but most were repaired and returned to service within days. The kill ratio? 6-1, in favor of the inferior Sherman. It didn't make sense on paper. But war isn't fought on paper. It's fought in fog, in mud, in ambushes, by men who think on their feet and talk to each other. And in the fields around Aricourt, the myth of German tank superiority died in fire and steel. The Americans didn't just survive, they dominated. Why it worked by the end of September 1944, two things were clear. First, the Battle of Aricourt was a stunning American victory. Second, it should not have happened, not according to the math. On paper, the Sherman was still inferior. Thinner armor, shorter gun, lower range. Against a Panther in open terrain, it didn't stand a chance. So how did it win? Because war isn't decided by specifications. It's decided by execution. And Aricourt proved that 5 key advantages, none of them technical, had turned the tide. First, training. The 4th Armored Division wasn't made of rookies. They'd been in combat since Normandy. They had survived hedgerow fighting, close quarters ambushes, and months of brutal attrition. They had learned how to work together, platoon by platoon, crew by crew. The German panzer brigades they faced, freshly assembled. Most crews had only a few weeks of training. Many had never fired a shot in combat. They were rushed to the front with new tanks, new commanders, and no time to learn. Experience beat equipment. Second, tactics. The Americans adapted. They didn't fight the Panthers head on. They flanked, they set traps, they used terrain, they repositioned constantly. Every Sherman that survived one fight came back smarter for the next. The Germans, by contrast, followed doctrine. They advanced in columns. They stuck to formations. They expected the enemy to run or be overwhelmed. And when that didn't happen, they had no plan B. The U.S. fought the battle that was actually in front of them. The Germans fought the one they thought they were supposed to win. Third, communication. Every Sherman had a radio. That meant every tank commander could talk directly to his unit. They could coordinate fire, flank in real time, redirect artillery, warn about ambushes, and call in air support. It turned individual tanks into a synchronized force. German tanks? Only the lead vehicles had radios. Everyone else followed signals, flags, hand gestures, or simply following the tank in front. In thick fog, in fluid battlefields, those methods fell apart. In Aricourt, radio wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon. Fourth, logistics. Shermans were easy to repair. Crews could fix them in the field. Spare parts were common. And even when one was knocked out, another could be rolled off the supply lines the next day. The Panther? Not so simple. Its complex transmission failed frequently. It was harder to repair. It required experienced mechanics. And by 1944, Germany didn't have enough of either. Every Panther lost was a permanent loss. Every Sherman knocked out was just another repair job. Fifth, terrain and weather. Aricourt wasn't open plains. It was rolling hills, narrow roads, hidden woods, and thick fog. The same fog that grounded the Luftwaffe also erased the Panther's long-range advantage. Close-range fighting made the Sherman lethal again. Terrain and visibility forced a knife fight, where armor mattered less and reflexes mattered more. In these conditions, the Shermans were wolves. The Panthers were elephants, big, powerful, but blind and slow to turn. And over 10 days, that difference added up. American tankers, once fearful of their own machines, now believed in them. Because the Sherman's strength had never been about armor. It was about what you could do with it when you worked as a team. At Aracourt, the death trap became the hammer. And the Panthers, one by one, were smashed. You'd think a battle like Aracourt would have made headlines. 281 German tanks destroyed. A kill ratio that flipped the entire reputation of the Sherman tank. An American force outnumbered and outgunned, but victorious by sheer tactical superiority. But in October 1944, almost nobody was talking about it. The front page stories focused on something else. Operation Market Garden. The Allied gamble in Holland had failed. Thousands of paratroopers were dead or captured. Montgomery's end the war by Christmas plan had collapsed. That disaster soaked up the attention of the press and the war's decision makers. Aracourt. It got a brief mention in Stars and Stripes, a paragraph or two. No ticker tape, no glory. Major General John East Wood praised his tankers. Patton sent a commendation. But beyond that, silence. Why? Because Aracourt didn't fit the narrative. It proved that the Sherman could beat the Panther, not by firepower, but by skill. It suggested that the Ordnance Department's resistance to upgrading the Sherman's gun might have cost lives. It implied that doctrine had been wrong all along, and institutions don't like being proven wrong. So the official line remained: the Sherman was adequate. Aracourt was a fluke, a favorable engagement. The conditions just happened to help us. No mention of the training, or the tactics, or the breakdowns in German planning. Just a quiet reshuffling of papers and a determination not to change anything big. Production of 75mm Shermans continued. No urgent shift to the newer variants. No sweeping tactical revision. Even in the ranks, the myth persisted. Sherman crews in other divisions still believed the 5-to-1 ratio. Still called their tanks Ronson lighters. Still assumed that if they met a Panther, they'd die first. The truth about Aracourt was buried beneath bureaucracy, distraction, and institutional pride. It would take decades for the real story to emerge. And in the meantime, the same mistakes were made again. The pattern and the warning. Aracourt should have changed everything. It showed that training, tactics, and communication mattered more than raw numbers or firepower. That smart soldiers with average equipment could outperform elite hardware in the right hands. But it didn't stick. In Korea, a few years later, M4 Shermans were pulled out of storage and sent to fight Soviet-built T-34s. Once again, American crews, some with World War II experience, held the line. They used the same principles: coordination, mobility, flanking, and they won. But once again, the story faded. In the Cold War, tank design shifted toward bigger guns and thicker armor. The M48, the M60, more power, more complexity, but also more maintenance problems. The lesson of Aracourt, simplicity, coordination, experience, was buried under steel. The U.S. Army Armor School studied Aracourt in the 1950s. Their conclusion? Training was the single most important factor in tank warfare. But that report? Filed away, forgotten. It took historians like Stephen Zaloga decades later to bring it back. His work in the 1990s and 2000s revealed the truth behind the numbers. The Sherman wasn't a death trap. In most battles, it achieved equal or superior kill ratios. Aracourt wasn't an anomaly. It was the model. In the Gulf War of 1991, the USB used modern tactics, real-time communication, overwhelming coordination, high training standards. American tanks destroyed more than 2,000 Iraqi vehicles. Only 23 Abrams were lost. Kill ratio? Almost 90-to-1. The same lesson. relearned. Even in Ukraine today, older tanks and skilled hands are holding off supposedly superior machines, because coordination, flexibility, and leadership still matter more than steel. Our court was never just a battle. It was a warning. A warning that if you forget the human factor, if you put blind faith in technology, you will lose. Eventually. It happened in 1944. It happened again, and it will keep happening. Unless we remember the lesson buried in the fog of Lorraine.